Today, we are going to give you a crash course on the history of ancient Egypt on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we are going to give you a top-down overview of the history of ancient Egypt. If you like these videos and wish to help out, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel. And if you'd like to help us financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member or by purchasing my book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, An Illustrated Journey, available at all major bookstores. Okay, today we're going to give you the 10,000-foot view of the history of ancient Egypt. Now, when we talk about the history of ancient Egypt, we need to separate absolute dating from relative dating. And what do we mean by that? Well, let's say I give you some dates. 1918, 1939, 1965. These are, say, important dates. And they're absolute dates. They give you an exact year. But let's say I give you instead World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. In the first example, I gave you an absolute dates. In the second example, I gave you relative dates. These are undated events that are relative to each other. Egyptologists like to talk more in terms of relative dating than we do in absolute dating. And that's because we often don't know the exact year certain things happened, but we can figure out that one event preceded the other. And this is why when we talk about the history of ancient Egypt, we tend to talk more in the terms of, say, dynasties, kingdoms, and periods. And we're going to give you the top-down view of the history of Egypt from its earliest periods until the time it ceased to be an independent nation. So we are going to, start with the whole term of dynasties. Now, a dynasty is usually a succession of rulers that are essentially related by direct bloodline, direct descent. Sometimes there's other reasons for the formation of the dynasty, such as political shifts or changes in, say, important architecture, but those are an advanced topic. But we generally break down the history of Egypt into about 30 dynasties. And those dynasties are then grouped into periods or kingdoms. The history of Egypt is broken down into three major kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And before and after and between those kingdoms are other periods, which we will discuss as we go along. But if you remember the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, you've got a pretty good framework to start with. So, let's begin with the prehistoric period. Egypt has a prehistoric period usually called the Predynastic Period. And for most Egyptologists, we don't go very far back into that because you start then getting into paleontology, and that's outside of our field. But the prehistory of Egypt usually refers to a period known as the Nagata period. And the Nagata period is broken down into three subperiods: Nagata 1, Nagata 2, and Nagata 3. And Nagata 3 is sometimes called Dynasty 0. And it's called Dynasty 0 because it's the period where we first see the written names of kings. One of the most famous of these kings is the Scorpion King, or King Scorpion. And he is shown on the Scorpion mace head, which was an important pre-dynastic artifact. Now, the kings of the pre-dynastic period represent a time before Egypt was united as a single kingdom. Egypt is often called the land of two kingdoms, or the kingdom of two lands, because it actually represents the unification of two kingdoms, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Basically, Upper Egypt is anything south of Cairo. Lower Egypt is the Nile Delta. And in the first dynasty of Egypt, those lands were united under a single king. And as far as we can tell, one of the first kings of the very first dynasty of Egypt was named Aha, and he was part of the unification wars and successfully combined the two kingdoms. Now, when we talk about King Aha, we're already now into the first dynasty, Dynasty 1. The earliest period in, say, Egyptian history proper, Dynasty 1, Dynasty 2, is called the Early Dynastic Period. This is a short period that took place just before the Old Kingdom. And we know the kings of this era from the burials that took place at Abydos. Burials such as King Jer, King Jet, basically these early dynastic kings. Kasum Kemwe is a famous example of one of these. And there is some hint that these early Egyptian kings practiced human sacrifice. But fortunately, that does not seem to have gone on past the Second Dynasty. Now, after the early dynastic period, we get into the first major kingdom in Egypt, called the Old Kingdom. And that represents dynasties 3 through to 8. And a lot of things happened during the Old Kingdom. It's a very interesting time. During Dynasty 3, we have the beginnings of the pyramid. King Zoser, who built the step pyramid at Saqqara. Dynasty 4, where we have the great pyramids at Giza, pyramids of Khufu, Menkaure, and Khafre, and the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau. Dynasty 5, where we see the invention of the sun temples, which were these private temples with raised platforms dedicated to the sun god. And Dynasty 6, where we have, say, the Pyramid of Unis, where we see pyramid text for the first time written inside a pyramid. Up until Dynasty 6, pyramids were never decorated on the inside with writing or art. This is a new innovation, even though decorated mastabas long preceded this time, but pyramids themselves were not decorated. So it's a very interesting development that we all of a sudden in Dynasty 6 see many pyramids with these pyramid texts. Now, during Dynasty 7 and 8, the Old Kingdom starts to go into decline. One of the things about the Old Kingdom is that power started to be drawn away from the king, from the royal family. And power became decentralized. The regional governors started collecting power for themselves, started doing their own taxation. Administrators started to enrich themselves. And these bureaucrats started producing tombs that rivaled the glory and splendor of a royal tomb. Well, that didn't last all that long. Up until this point during the Old Kingdom, the capital had remained at a place called Memphis, which is a city just outside of Saqqara. But during Dynasty 7 or 8, the royal family moved the capital from Memphis to Heracleopolis, which was a major cult center at the time. And it's during the next phase, the first intermediate period, the period that comes after the Old Kingdom, dynasties 9, 10, and 11, where we get a period of civil war. The Heracleopolitan rulers, the rulers that had built the pyramids, this line of kings, was now being contested. One of the regional governors from Thebes decided he should be king. And this marked a period of civil war. Well, ultimately, the Heracleopolitans lost the fight, and the Thebans won. And when the Thebans won, they established a new kingdom called the Middle Kingdom. And they based their new capital at the city of Lisht. Now, Lisht is located in the Fayum, where it's sort of centralized. It was a city designed for effective governance over the whole of Egypt. No longer were they sequestered away. They would be sort of like a spider in the center of a web, pulling the strings. And the Middle Kingdom is a very important period because it's sort of the height of Egyptian culture. It's well known for its Middle Egyptian language. When we teach Egyptian to students for the first time, we usually teach them the Middle Egyptian dialect, and it's the dialect that comes from the Middle Kingdom. It's the time of great literature, like prophecies of Nefertiti, Ipuwer. All these great pieces of Middle Kingdom literature come from this period. And the 11th dynasty that started the Middle Kingdom, started off well. You had the Mentuhoteps. But the last king sort of became incapacitated. We don't know if it's a physical illness or a mental illness, but he became no longer able to rule. At that point, he was replaced by a vizier, who basically was the substitute king until Mentuhotep IV finally passed away. When Amenemhat I, the vizier, became king, the first king of Dynasty 12. This started a very powerful line of kings. These were kings that reigned for long periods of time. Many of these kings reigned 30 years. They were long-lived, they were powerful, they had expanded their reach into Kush and the Levant. They would raid the Levant for all this war booty and then bring it back. And they built this kingdom on the backs of its hegemonic powers. So, what happened, though, was at, say, the end of Dynasty 12, we have the beginning of Dynasty 13, and we see a shift in power here. Instead of being a few very long-lived, powerful kings, Dynasty 13 is marked by something else. Dynasty 13 has a lot of short-reigning kings. And these kings, we don't know why they reigned so short. Some of them reigned for only a couple years. Some of them reign as long as 10 years. We don't know the reason, but there's like 20 or 30 of them. There's a lot of them. And we start seeing the Middle Kingdom start to lose control. There doesn't seem to be a civil war, even though a competing dynasty seems to form at the same time. But there doesn't seem to be a period of civil war like the First Intermediate Period. They just lose control. They just lose their grip on things. And eventually what has to happen is Dynasty 13 has to retreat back to Thebes. It has to abandon Lisht because it can't control the country anymore. It's not safe for them at Lisht. So they retreat to Thebes where their power base is. So this marks the end of the Middle Kingdom. Well, meanwhile, in the Nile Delta, we have a large Semitic city, Avaris, that's populated by these Amorites that are called the Hyksos. And 30 years goes by since the Theban dynasty loses control, and the Hittites go, hey, wait, nobody's in charge. Somebody's got to be in charge. Why can't it be us? And they established their own dynasty, the Hyksos rulers of Dynasty 15. And this begins the Second Intermediate Period, where you have now Egypt divided again. You have the Hyksos controlling the Nile Delta all the way south almost to Thebes. You have a Theban principality right in the middle of Egypt. And below them to the south is a very powerful Kushite kingdom, squeezing the Thebans from the south. And that sort of marks how the power structure was during the Second Intermediate Period. Now, during this period, the Hyksos enrich themselves. They take the produce and the metalwork and the wealth of Egypt, and they trade it. They send ships all around the Mediterranean trading Egyptian goods, and they get really, really wealthy. They're incredibly wise managers. But they also squeeze the native Egyptians for as much tax as they can get. This causes some friction. And we will discuss what happens with that friction on the next episode of Ancient Egypt in the Bible, where we're going to talk about the New Kingdom to the Roman period. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.